possible goods there are. 2, we have no good reason for thinking the possible evils we know of are representative of the possible evils there are. 3, we have no good reason for thinking that the entailment relations we know of between possible goods and the permission of possible evils are representative of the entailment relations there are between possible goods and the permission of possible evils. And then lastly, we have no good reason for thinking that the total moral value or disvalue we perceive in certain complex states of affairs accurately reflects the total moral value or disvalue they really have. Skip to section B, 1B. In light of these more careful statements of commonsensism and the skeptical theist's skepticism, we can ask ourselves again whether it is problematic to combine the knowledge claims of the former with the knowledge disavowals of the latter. It will help to focus on an imagined non-theist commonsensist named Sally, who is an agnostic, and yet endorses the skeptical theist's skeptical theses, ST1 through ST4. Because she's a commonsensist, Sally thinks many of the most obvious perceptual, memory, introspective, logical, mathematical, and moral beliefs she has count as knowledge. But she also thinks her knowledge has its limits, and that there are many things she doesn't know. She thinks there are many facts about the physical universe of which she is ignorant, facts about what's happening at the subatomic level or in distant galaxies or on other planets in our solar system, or even across the city or behind a nearby closed door. There's much about what others are thinking or feeling that she doesn't know, much of her own past that she can't remember, and many logical, mathematical, and moral truths about which she is in the dark. None of these claims to ignorance seem the least bit in tension with her commonsensist knowledge claims. Now, suppose Sally goes on to add that among the things she thinks she doesn't know are certain facts about the possible goods and evils there are. In particular, she has no idea how likely it is that the possible goods, evils, and entailments between them that she knows of are representative of the possible goods, evils, and entailments between them that an omniscient being would take into account when considering whether to permit evils. Likewise, for certain of the more complex possible goods and evils she knows of, she has no idea how likely it is that the total value or disvalue she perceives in them accurately reflects the total value or disvalue that an omniscient being would see in them. These claims about human ignorance also seem highly plausible. Are they in tension with Sally's commonsensist knowledge claims? Here's a way in which they might be in tension. Perhaps Sally claims to know of some act that it would be morally wrong for her to perform it. Her main reason for thinking that the act would be wrong is that she can see that the immediate result of the action would be enormous harm to a child, and she has no reason for thinking any significant good will come from it. But perhaps, because of considerations like those mentioned in ST1 through ST4, she also thinks that she has no idea how likely it is that the consequences of the act would, in the long run, be for the best. For all she knows, it might be highly likely that the long-run consequences of performing the act would be much better than the long-run consequences of her refraining from it. Then again, for all she knows, this might be highly unlikely. She really has no idea what the remote connections might be between this act and other possible goods and evils. Now we have a possible tension. As a matter of common sense, Sally thinks she knows it's wrong to perform the act because of its harmful consequences, the immediate ones she can foresee. And yet, because she accepts ST1 through ST4, she also thinks she has no idea whether or not its ultimate consequences are likely to be for the best overall. Does this skepticism about ultimate consequences threaten her moral knowledge? It needn't. Suppose Sally also reasonably holds the following view about morality, which I'll call M. Some actions are intrinsically wrong, that is, wrong regardless of their consequences. But for some other actions, our judgments about their consequences matter much more, morally speaking. For these latter actions, we morally ought to, and then I have 3 things that we morally ought to do. A, consider for an appropriate length of time the consequences we can reasonably expect of performing them and of the live alternatives to performing them. B, refrain from performing them if the reasonably expected consequences of performing them seem significantly worse than the reasonably expected consequences of one of the live alternatives. And C, perform them if the reasonably expected consequences of performing them seem significantly better than the reasonably expected consequences of each of the live alternatives. Can a person reasonably hold M? There don't seem to be any compelling objections to M that make it any more problematic than any other standard but controversial view in ethics. And objectors to skeptical theism haven't, to my knowledge, offered or relied on any such objections. Can M be coherently combined with Sally's agnosticism about theism, her agnosticism about theism, her commonsensism, and her endorsement of the skeptical theist's skepticism? Again, there don't seem to be any good reasons for thinking it couldn't be, and objectors to skeptical theism haven't, to my knowledge, argued that this combination would be incoherent. But then the alleged tension mentioned in the previous paragraph disappears. If Sally rationally endorses M, then it's no problem for her to combine her confidence in the wrongness of an act based on her comparative evaluation of the reasonably expected consequences of performing it and of the live alternatives to performing it, and her views about what she ought to do in light of that, with her professed ignorance of its ultimate long-term consequences. What else can a skeptical theist know? It will be helpful to consider what other things Sally, this common sense agnostic, can know, despite endorsing the skeptical theist's skepticism. I've already noted that if she rationally endorses M, or even if in practice she seems to tacitly take for granted something like M, it's plausible to think she knows obvious moral truths about actions that are morally right or wrong for us to perform because of what the reasonably expected consequences of them and their alternatives would be. In addition, there will be nothing in ST1 through ST4 that will keep her from knowing, perhaps via moral intuition, certain moral truths about what is intrinsically wrong, regardless of the consequences. Stepping outside of the realm of moral knowledge, consider the many obvious things that Sally knows via perception, introspection, and memory. Take, for example, her knowledge that she has hands. Given Sally's commonsensism, in particular clause B, she knows, in addition to the fact that she has hands, that she's not a handless brain in a vat being deceived into thinking she's got hands. And similarly, she knows that if God exists, then God doesn't have an all things considered good reason for making it seem that she has hands when in fact she doesn't. She knows this despite her endorsement of ST1 through ST4, which place pretty significant constraints on her knowledge of what God's reasons might be. By endorsing ST1 through ST4, Sally is committing herself to the view that we don't know, just by reflecting on possible goods, possible evils, the entailments between them and their seeming value or disvalue. We don't know in that way what God's reasons might be. But it doesn't follow that we have no way at all of knowing anything about what reasons God might have for doing things if God existed. We know that if an act is intrinsically wrong, regardless of the consequences, a morally perfect being like God would have an all things considered good reason not to do it. We know that we exist, and so we know that if God exists, he didn't have an all things considered good reason for permanently annihilating us before now. In general, for all the things we commonsensically know to be true, we know that God, if God exists, didn't have an all things considered good reason to make them false. To sum up, it's obviously not a problem for a commonsensist to combine her claims to knowledge with claims to ignorance, for commonsensism includes the view that we have knowledge, and it denies that we are omniscient. In combining commonsensism with the skeptical theist's skepticism, two main questions arise. First, what sorts of ignorance are consistent with commonsensism? And secondly, what sorts of knowledge are consistent with the skeptical theist's skepticism? In response to the first question, I've argued that the skeptical theist's skepticism, like skepticism about many mathematical, logical, moral, historical, and scientific claims, is consistent with commonsensism. And in response to the second question, I've argued that it's consistent with the skeptical theist's skepticism to claim knowledge of obvious moral truths about the wrongness of an act if their reasonably expected consequences seem terrible. It's consistent with that skepticism to claim knowledge of the wrongness of an act that is seen to be intrinsically wrong, of God's having an all things considered good reason if God exists not to perform certain acts, i.e. those that are seen to be intrinsically wrong, and knowledge of God's not having an all things considered good reason if God exists to make false the things we commonsensically know to be true. Thus, an agnostic like Sally can use the skeptical theist's skepticism to resist the no-seum inference in the argument from evil, given above in the first section of this paper, all the while endorsing commonsensism. Okay, so section 2, a perfectly loving God wouldn't permit that. Here's a challenge for the common sense skeptical theist position. Commonsensists think they know that God, if God exists, doesn't have an all things considered good reason to make false the things they know as a matter of common sense to be true. After all, they know that these things weren't made false, and yet God, if he exists, would have made them false if he had an all things considered good reason to do so. Thus, for example, they they know as a matter of common sense that they haven't been annihilated, so they